uh, uh, insect pests in the garden and how to manage those pests. And my take on it is to talk about some of the tools that we use for home gardening and how we can minimize losses, or at least make those losses acceptable when it comes to some of the insect pests. So rather than talk about, this is the Colorado potato beetle, this is what we do, this is a European corn borer, this is what we do, I was going to address it with these are some of the tools we have, and these are some examples on how we use them. So a lot of my pictures come from larger scale operations. Generally, I work a lot with the small, what I call truck farmers, people that are growing stuff for farmers markets. But some of those same tools that you use on those small farm plots are exactly the same types of tools that you can consider using in the home garden. So, one of the things I think about, particularly as the season starts, is what can we do to prevent insect pests from the onset? How do we keep them out of the garden preventively? And these are some of the tools, or some of the tactics we have to prevent them. So one of the first things is crop rotation. Don't grow the same types of plants in the same spot every year. Sometimes just moving those plants 4 or 5 feet into a new section of the garden can help tremendously. A lot of times, we plant our vegetables, we get to the point in the season where we're beginning to harvest them. We go through harvest, and then we sort of forget about that crop. We may have cut all the cabbage heads off, or we may have picked the last squash off the plant, and we sort of walk away. That's one thing you don't want to do. As soon as you're done harvesting the last bit that you're going to take from those plants, you need to destroy those plants. Bury them, dig them up, shred them, put them into a compost or something like that. And that's what I call my after harvest cleanup. It's so important because for a lot of the insect pests, the small parts of the plant you leave behind allow them to continue their development and to get to a stage where they can survive the winter. So as soon as we're done, we want to pull that stuff up, starve them out, and hopefully next year we'll have fewer problems. Site selection is very good. We generally, for vegetable gardening, we want good sunlight. We want well-drained soils. So try and match your plants with the site that you have. Think about resistant plants, if those are available. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. Think about shorter maturity plants. If you've had problems with certain pests, if you can find varieties that don't take as long to mature, they have less exposure to the pests. And so that can be a tactic as well. Plant selection, intercropping, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Using the right planting dates. We have an extension publication called Home Vegetable Gardening, HO 128, that's available at the county extension offices. And it has charts with all those planting dates for the various vegetables that you might be growing. It's important that you follow those. If you don't, you may predispose them to certain types of pests. Preservation of natural enemies, and what I mean by that are some of the good bugs or good insects that are out there, the lady beetles and lacewings and ground beetles and things like that that eat insects and eat pests. We need to preserve those in the garden. I'm going to talk a little bit about exclusion tonight, using row covers and netting. And then one thing I'm not going to say much beyond this, but if you lose 20% of your potato yield to Colorado potato beetle, why not plant 25% more potatoes this year and just expect some of those losses? So if you do get some losses to some insect pests, you're going to overplant and you're still going to get what you need. So in terms of insect management strategies, what I was just talking to you about were the cultural controls, a lot of the things you use preventively. Netting and things like that are physical controls we use to exclude insect pests. You know, the natural enemies, we call that biological control. So using the good insects to fight the bad insects, and that's very important for us. And then I list it last, but you know, it's still something we do use, and that's chemical pest management. What I mean by that are, you know, the pesticides, using the uh, uh, Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew or Bonide 8 or something like that. We still have those, but we tend to use those chemicals as a last resort. You know, one of the things I do emphasize is some of the concepts about, you know, how insects attack plants. And one of the concepts is, are they a direct or indirect pest? A direct pest eats the parts of the plant that I want to eat. You know, when they're attacking an apple tree, they're eating the apples. And so that's a direct pest. But the indirect pests are ones that eat parts of the plant that I'm not particularly interested in. You know, a Japanese beetle that might be eating the leaves on my grapes. I really don't like eating grape leaves. And so that's an indirect pest. And I can tolerate those a little bit more than I can with the ones that are direct pests. So direct pests are usually ones that we target with our controls. Indirect pests, we really let those build up a while before we have to do something about them. Another thing is that, you know, what we call a economic injury level, or just how much damage can you tolerate from a pest. You know, if you have one aphid on a lettuce leaf, that's not a big deal. You know, it's going to take lots and lots of aphids before it is a problem. So think about those economic injury levels. You know, how much damage is the pest actually doing, or is it doing any damage at all? So those are some of the things you need to think about when you see some of these pests in the garden. So, you know, one of the techniques, and I think it's really a good technique for home gardeners, is what I call farmscaping, or you could call it gardenscaping. But trying to maximize the diversity in your garden, this really helps to build up natural enemies. It's good habitat for pollinators and things like that. And in this picture, I have some pepper plants. It's a small plot of peppers, and the plant on the left there in the picture, that's actually buckwheat. And we put buckwheat in these plots because they bring in pollinators, they bring in natural enemies of pests, and they hold them there. They give them food for the natural enemies and the pollinators when there may not be food on the peppers, and it keeps them in the garden, and we get more benefit from them that way. And so we like having that diversity in our vegetable gardens. Attracts the beneficial insects. What we found is that a lot of these plants with smaller flowers are actually more attractive to the good insects. So things like sweet alyssum, you know, buckwheat, those are good, you know, mountain mint, that's another one. Those are good to bring in some of these insects. The big showy flowers, you know, they may bring in butterflies, but they're not really bringing in the beneficial insects that we need. There's some plants with extra floral nectaries. What we mean by that are they have nectar producing parts of the plants that are not in the flowers. Things like southern peas have those. And even when they're not flowering, you'll get pollinators that will come visit them and get nectar from other parts of the plant. And again, I may be a little bit biased, but we use a lot of buckwheat to help us out. And it does help with the pollinators as well. Another thing to help with the natural enemies and the pollinators is to be very judicious with your pesticides. Even though home pesticides may not be as concentrated as what a lot of commercial farmers use, oftentimes they have the same active ingredients and they can do the same amount of harm to some of these beneficial insects. So these are some things that I encourage people to consider. First is, use pesticides only if they're needed. If they're not needed, you're wasting your money. You're also probably doing some indirect damage that's unneeded. So if you do need them, that's fine. But if you don't, it's best to leave them in storage and not use them. Be sure and read and follow label directions. I probably read as many pesticide labels as anyone in Kentucky, and I still learn new things by reviewing those labels. There's a lot of good information on there, a lot of information to protect you, to protect the environment, even to protect the plants you're spraying. And it's all on the pesticide label. Whenever possible, use the pesticides that are most selective. So a lot of times we can find pesticides that will control the pests, but they won't hurt the natural enemies, they won't hurt the pollinators, they won't hurt fish, they won't hurt you. So we try and find the ones that are going to do the job for us without having all the side effects associated with them. So we call those selective pesticides. And last, particularly with insecticides, we have to think about pollinators, and don't use insecticides that are toxic to pollinators when the pollinators are active. So, and when they're going to be active is during the day and on plants in flower. And so if you had to spray a plant in flower like a squash plant, do it at night, because the bees are not going to be active, and the next day you'll get new flowers that will open, and that tends to minimize the damage to the pollinators. I'm a beekeeper, so I am sensitive to that. You can purchase beneficial insects. We do it occasionally, particularly where we put row covers over plants. We put row covers on there to keep insects out, but sometimes you'll get mite or aphid problems develop in the row covers or in high tunnels. And we'll purchase, wasps that parasitize these pests, or lady beetles and things like that. And when you release them in enclosed areas, they can work. We generally don't recommend releasing them in open areas because they tend to disperse, and you may have helped everyone in your county, but you're not going to see much effect on your own farm. This is a little bit of data. It's a little bit older, but it's just showing a student of mine did this, and where she had buckwheat, she was getting a higher level of parasitism of European corn borer than without the buckwheat. And she was getting fewer peppers damaged where she had the natural enemies. And you can see these bars, the difference. So she was able to cut the damage down just by having some buckwheat at the end of her pepper rows. And so that's showing when you do diversify things, you keep those beneficial insects around, and they're going to be like guardians of the garden if there's resources there for them. Another good technique for vegetable gardening is early soil preparation. So I tend to tell people, small farmers or gardeners, if you're going to plant, your potatoes and your tomatoes and all your other crops, you need to work that soil at least 2 weeks before you plant. Don't work the soil and bury those weeds in the same day plant your crops, because you'll end up with some pest problems. Seed corn maggot, they're attracted to those rotting, decaying plants that you just buried. Black cutworm, a lot of times they're already out there, and they're small larvae. And when you take away the weeds they were feeding on, and then you put something there that you like, they'll just switch over and start feeding on your plant. So if you prepare your soil a couple of weeks in advance, you can starve out a lot of these pests, particularly these two groups of insects. Resistant varieties. You may have your favorite variety, but there may be some similar varieties that are going to be more resistant to the insect pests. The insects don't damage them as much, or they don't build up on them as much. And I just listed some examples here of some of those. One of my favorite vegetables is sweet corn, and I grow sweet corn every year. But when I pick out those varieties, I look in the seed catalogs, and I try and find those varieties of sweet corn that have long, tight husk leaves. And that helps to fight the corn earworm. It doesn't keep the corn earworm out, but it limits the damage to the very end of the tip. And one reason why I like long leaves is that it also reduces the amount of bird damage. When you have sweet corn, the ear grows past the husk leaves, you're going to get a lot more bird damage. You're going to get a lot of more sap beetle damage to the tip of that ear. So you want varieties that really cover those ears with nice, tight, long husk leaves, and that's going to help limit that damage. Another example would be with cucumbers. I was visiting a organic grower, and he had this huge 300-foot long row of cucumbers, and they were out there picking them with a wheelbarrow. And I said, well, what do you do for cucumber beetles and bacterial wilt? And he goes, well, I don't do anything. I said, how does that work? How are you picking all those? And he says, well, I use this Arkansas little leaf pickling cucumber, and it doesn't get the bacterial wilt. And I was just amazed. So, that gets him out of having to treat for the cucumber beetles and prevent the bacterial wilt with insecticides. So he found a resistant variety that works very well with that. We get a lot of aphid transmitted viruses among vegetables in Kentucky. And for a lot of those viruses, we have resistant varieties, tomatoes and peppers and squash and things like that, that are resistant to those common viruses. So you should look for that when you're selecting varieties. And then lastly, days to maturity. Shorter maturing varieties have less exposure to pests, and you can often limit the amount of damage just because you're going to harvest them much faster in the field. And so that can be another tactic as well. So crop rotation works well with annual plants and vegetables. It's best to switch plant families. So, the plot that you grew your sweet corn in, that might be a great plot to put your tomatoes in next year, because they're not in the same plant family and there's going to be different types of pests. So, switching around those plant families. If you plant your tomatoes after your peppers, well, they're in the same plant family, and you're not going to get a lot of benefit from switching those two plant groups. Crop rotation helps with soil-borne diseases, and it really fights insects that overwinter in immature stages in the soil. Things like white grubs and corn rootworm eggs. Some of these insects, in the spring, they can only move, a foot or two in the soil. So they're not going to be able to switch to another part of the garden where you've moved that crop. So that's where crop rotation can really help. And it also helps with plant diseases. It helps with plant nutrition. So it's just a general good practice to rotate the soil that you grow your crops in. Another tactic we've used quite a bit is what we call trap cropping. And as you see in that picture down at the bottom, that's an example of a trap cropping field. That's a small pepper field surrounded by sunflowers and millet. We use Japanese and pearl millet, and we surround it. And what we were trying to do was find something to keep the stink bugs from attacking the peppers. And how it works is, as the stink bugs start moving towards the pepper field, they land on something they like. They really like sunflowers. They really like millet, and it stops them. They have their food. They don't need to continue going into the center part of the garden. And you could do this with a big vegetable garden. You could have your tomatoes and peppers and other things in there, even your sweet corn that stink bugs like. And with a trap crop, you prevent them from getting to the center. They've done this a lot with cucumber beetle, and particularly with stink bugs. And I have a little bit of data from last year with my student, and this is just some data with stink bugs. And you can see in terms of the pepper plot that did not have a trap crop around it, that's the dashed line. And you can see we had many more brown marmorated stink bugs in the field. The trap crop, or the pepper field that had the trap crop, is the solid black line. You can see we had fewer stink bugs, and they came in much later. In the trap crop itself, the sunflowers, that's that red line there. So it is effective. We were able to reduce damage to the peppers by more than 50% by using a trap crop. Very good for a small vegetable garden. A grower that has 30 acres, probably not going to do that. And I have to say, if you do have some problems with these stink bugs, this new stink bug that gets into your home during the winter, there is some relief in the future. There's this little wasp, they call it the samurai wasp. They've given it a really cool name. It's a tiny wasp, it's a stingless wasp. It's also from China. It got here on its own, and it's now found in 11 states. On this slide, I say it kills 70% of the stink bugs in Asia. That's not true. It probably kills closer to 80% of the stink bug eggs in Asia. It is in 11 states. It's in West Virginia. It's in Pennsylvania. It's in Ohio. We have not found it yet in Kentucky, but I think this is really going to help reduce stink bug numbers in the future. So there is some relief out there. Another thing is planting dates. Use the recommended planting dates. Planting too early favors a lot of soil insects. They're active when the soil is cool. The plants are not growing, the seeds are not germinating, they're not coming out of the ground, and they're being fed on by some of these insects. So things like seed corn maggots and wireworms are active at low temperatures. So if you wait with your planting until the soils are warm, you're going to get more rapid germination, more rapid seedling emergence, and there's going to be less opportunity for these insects to attack those small plants and those transplants. So use those recommended planting dates. What we found with sweet corn, the corn earworm that you see in this bottom center picture there, that's the key pest. And that one usually doesn't overwinter very well in Kentucky. It has to migrate from Texas and Louisiana each year. And so if we plant early, say, May 10th, a lot of times we can get a good crop of sweet corn without any corn earworm damage. But if we wait until June 10th to plant our sweet corn, we tend to have just about every year, we'll have a big fat corn earworm in there. So that's one where, if we can get the corn in as early as possible, but still late enough that we're not going to have some of those soil pests, we can get a good harvest without having to do much to manage that pest. With cucurbits, things like melons and cucumbers, delaying planting just a little bit till we get to about this time of year, beginning of June, we can often escape that first generation of cucumber beetles. And that's one where just knowing when those beetles are going to come out, you can try and avoid that by delaying planting just a little bit. I've actually had students do a lot of work with row covers and other exclusion things. That first one with the netting up there, that was for brown marmorated stink bug, and we used different sizes of netting. Next slide, I was going to show you a little bit of how that worked, but we've done some stuff with tobacco cloth, that's the row covers. We've used screening, those mesotunnels. In fact, I was out putting some of that up this afternoon. And we've even done some stuff with fruit bagging. These are small bags. You can use the small grocery bags you get at the store and twist ties, and you can put around the fruit, and it keeps the insects from getting on the fruit. We actually have a fact sheet online on how you can do that for a home garden. Again, that works pretty well if you have 5 or 6 trees. You have 5,000 or 6,000 trees. No, that's not a tactic that we would recommend, but it works quite well. And you can see with the exclusion of the pests, the insects that I list there, cucumber beetles and squash bugs and flea beetles, codling moths, stink bugs, they can all be excluded from plants using these types of techniques. So this is a study we did a few years ago using the different sizes of screening. We did this down in Knoxville as well as up in Lexington. And you can see we had some peppers with no screen, some with a screen that had 1/6 inch holes. Then we had 1/8 inch holes, and we had a very fine one, which was 1/25 of an inch. And where we had screening, we had less damage. And as the screening got finer and finer, we had less damage on the fruit, particularly in Tennessee, where they had a lot more pressure from the stink bug at the time. This is some work we've done with the screening for squash and melons. We use these hoops and just stretch the screening over that. And you can see the number of fruit per plot. If you look just at the green bars there, where we have no row cover, that's where we had the least number of fruit. The remay is the tobacco cloth, where we put it on, then we took it off for the plants to pollinate, and we put it back on. We did the same thing with the Protect, which is the screening that you have in the upper screen. And then we had another treatment where we had the best yield, and that's where we just left the screening on all year. And for small commercial growers, they would put a bumblebee colony, a commercial bumblebee colony they could buy and put it under the screen. But again, you can see how those screenings, you can use those to increase the yields and prevent the losses from some of these insect pests. Another thing that I really stress is around your gardens. It doesn't matter if you're gardening for fruit or vegetables or whatever, but you need to keep your weeds under control. And what I mean by that is going out at least once a month and mowing everything down, or using a herbicide if you want. But don't let it grow up and just, in the middle of the summer do one cutting and think you've done a good job, because you've let the insects build up in the weeds, and when you cut it down, they move over to the plants you're trying to grow. So keep the weeds under control continuously, every couple weeks, maybe as long as a month between mowings, but keep them under control. The insects that really helps out with are going to be the spider mites, the plant bugs and stink bugs, cutworms, as well as the viruses that the insects transmit. And the reason is a lot of these weeds carry the virus. They don't have any symptoms, but they're carrying the virus. And so we need to get them away from the garden by keeping the weeds under control. This is something that I do quite a bit, hand picking pests. Early in the season, the potatoes are just starting to come up. Maybe the plants are 8 to 10 inches tall, and you notice those first few Colorado potato beetles coming on the plants. I go out there, I pick them off. I usually drop them on the ground and I squash them with my foot. But some people will take a bucket and they'll go out in the morning with a 5-gallon bucket with a little bit of soapy water in the bottom, and they just knock the plants in, over the opening in the bucket there, and dislodge the beetles into the bucket, and they drowned in the soapy water. It's very good for Colorado potato beetle, Japanese beetle, green June beetle, even grape phylloxera on grape plants. It's a very small insect, but early in the year, when you start to see those little galls that look like little grape nuts on the undersides of the leaves, you just pull those leaves off. And we've had some people control grape phylloxera infestations by just removing those leaves with the galls. So hand picking, don't think that's not doing any good. It can be very good with those early colonizers. Sanitation, remove the debris around the planting. And what I mean by debris would be, the old tires and the sheets of rotted plywood that are near the garden, bowls and boards that some of these insects can hide under during the day. At night, when it's cool, they come out and they feed on your plants. Then during the day in the heat of the sun, they go back under those boards underneath that clutter. And we want to keep that clutter around the garden. It helps a lot with sow bugs, helps a lot with slugs. If you see plants that are heavily infested and diseased, sometimes we have to triage those plants. Sometimes it's not worth trying to nurse them back to health. They'll just spread their problems to other healthier plants. And so sometimes it's best just to dig up a plant and remove it from the garden. It's too much of a risk to the other plants around it. And again, after harvest, destroy your plants. Bury them, shred them, mow them, get rid of them. It really helps with management of squash vine borer, squash bug, and corn borer for the following year. So those are some good ones there. We've done some work with mulches. If you like using mulches in your garden, mulches repel aphids and whiteflies as they're flying over your garden. They look down and they see that silver there, and it's like they're looking up at the sky, and they don't see the green. They just see the flash of silver, and they keep flying, and they go somewhere else. And we did a study last year, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that, but it helps reduce some of those pests. This is our the results of aphids that were transmitting viruses. The different colored mulches are represented by the different colored bars. So the standard mulch a lot of growers use is black. We also tried white mulch. Sometimes people use white in the heat of the summer. The silver bar is the silver mulch, very reflective mulch. And you can see it was really repelling the aphids in this study. One thing that surprised us, when we used red mulch, we actually had more aphids coming to the plots. And so simply changing the colors of the mulches can help reduce the colonization of some of these pests. And we did see that we also reduced disease transmission in the silver mulch as well, because the aphids were not landing there and they weren't transmitting those viruses. And then last is, limit the use of broad spectrum insecticides. Pyrethrins tend to be a little bit more broad spectrum for home gardens. We do recommend that you try and monitor your pests and use those pesticides as needed, rather than just trying to spray weekly. That's often not the best strategy to overuse insecticides in the garden. And select some bio-friendly insecticides, things like BT or insecticidal soap or neem are going to be a lot safer for you, and they're going to be a lot safer for some of the beneficial insects out there as well. Recognize your pests. Be able to recognize insects, their natural enemies. The pictures that I have there of the pests, that lower picture has those little tiny wasps on that imported cabbage worm. Those little tiny wasps are going to kill that cabbage worm. And how they do it is they lay their eggs inside of that. And then that next picture that's above it and to the right, that's where the cabbage worm has been killed. The larvae have come out of the cabbage worm and they've spun cocoons. And each of those cocoons is going to produce a new wasp. And it's going to go out and hunt for more of those. And so natural enemies are very good. And most people are probably familiar with the hornworm, and those are the wasp pupae on the outside of the hornworm. And you can see there's one wasp that's already come out of that pupa there. But we have a guide on recognizing the beneficial insects. The worst thing you can do is find some beneficial insects, misidentify them as pests, and spray a pesticide to kill the beneficial insects. Now you've just made things worse. So that's why we have a guide on how to recognize the groups of beneficial insects. I do recommend that you go through your garden at least weekly and look at your plants. And what I mean by that is just not walking through and looking at them, but bending over, looking at the bud area of the plants, looking at some of the new leaves, look at the older leaves, and flip the leaves over, looking for insect pests. Identify what you find. If you can't identify it, send a picture to your county extension agent or bring a sample by your county extension office. Trapping for pests can be good. You see that slug trap there in the center. That's where they use a little bit of Budweiser as a attractant. The slugs fall in those traps and they drown. It's a pretty good home solution for slugs. Again, it's not very practical when you get into larger fields, but we have other traps like yellow sticky cards and things like that, or the SWD is the spotted winged Drosophila. It's that little fruit fly that gets into the raspberries and blackberries, and those are good tools to help you monitor and see what's going on in your garden. Be able to recognize things. There's some tricky things out there. The example I have here is the Colorado potato beetle, which we have here in Lexington. We also have its cousin, which is the false potato beetle. False potato beetle does not eat potatoes, does not eat tomatoes, but it eats Carolina horse nettle, and to a limited extent it eats eggplant. But a lot of times we'll see a little bit of Carolina horse nettle in our potatoes, and people will think, oh, I got Colorado potato beetle. It actually happened to be an insect that was feeding on the weed that's competing with your potatoes. And so the false potato beetle can be a beneficial, and the Colorado potato beetle can be the pest. When in doubt, get it identified. And so be able to recognize the common insect pests out there. Some are pretty easy to recognize, like some of these VW bugs. But the important thing is to look for them. If you scout weekly, you're going to catch problems before they're serious. And that's going to give you more options in terms of how you can control these problems. We do recommend that you use university recommendations to help manage these problems. And the reason is that we don't have an economic interest in this. We're just trying to help you find the most practical solution to some of your problems. And the last thing, this is my last slide, I was just going to show you some of the identification guides we have for a lot of our favorite fruits and vegetables in the home garden. And so these guides are available through the county extension offices. This is just a sample of the guides. We have some others. Each one is from, I don't know, 20 to 40 pages, and they have lots of color pictures in there to help you identify the pests. But we have those. And the reason why we have those is I feel if you can't identify the problem correctly, you can't manage it correctly. So once you get it identified, you can get out on the internet and search for solutions. That's pretty easy, but it's often getting the problem identified where we have the highest hurdle we have to get over. So we have these guides to help you out. So I've gone on for about 40 minutes now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know that Jeremy, you have a copy of the presentation. If people want that, they're welcome to get a copy of the presentation. I have no problems with that. So at this point,
Rick, I had a question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned companion plants that attracted beneficial insects, and then you talked about eliminating weeds. So is there a list of plants that are beneficial plants to attract beneficial insects versus a list of weeds?
There's some pretty good resources out there. I think Rodale's has some garden guides on some of those beneficial companion plants. So I would stick with those. But the other things, the pigweeds and the things that are just truly weeds that are not good, they're going to be breeding those plant bugs, those stink bugs, the leaf hoppers. They're going to have aphids on them. They're going to have mites. And so I would stick with the recommended companion plants and really remove the others that are not helpful at all. In fact, they're less than helpful. They're harmful, really, because they breed other things.
Anybody else have a question? If you need to, you can type in the chat pod. Well, Rick, evidently you answered all their questions. Okay, got one right here. Would garden be surrounded by a hayfield cause increased insect pressure? Good question.
That's a really good question, because a lot of people have hay fields, and I tell you, with the dry weather we've had in the last week, there's a lot of hay fields that have been cut. And what we tend to see in that situation is, while the hay's actively growing, it's not much of a problem. But once they cut that hay and the hay dries, all those insects that were in the hay, they have to move somewhere else and find something to feed on. And so a lot of times you see a big increase in insect pests right after they cut hay. So if my neighbor cut hay or I cut hay, probably the next couple days, just as soon as that hay's baled, I'd go through the garden and see if I'm picking up any insect pests before they have a chance to do damage.
Good question. Also, would it help to leave a standing buffer around the garden? And how wide would it have to be?
Well, that's the answer. Probably yes. It would help to have a buffer. They actually did some stuff in alfalfa out in California. They found that if they just cut strips rather than the whole field at once, they would actually maintain more beneficial insects, and they'd have fewer pest problems than if they cut the whole field at the same time. So, leaving a buffer is good. How wide would it have to be? That I'm not sure. 10 or 15 feet might be enough. And that's just a guess on my part.
Good questions. Also, does using mulch, things like leaves and hay, to increase organic matter, does it increase insect pressure?
Well, I would say be careful. And again, I'm getting a little bit out of entomology here, but I'm just going to use my other experience. But, particularly if you use hay, and if there's a lot of weed seed in the hay, you might be moving weed seed into your garden, and you're going to pay the price for that later when those weeds come up. So, clean straw can be very good. We use a lot of straw in strawberries, for example, but we try and get that's free of weeds and wheat seed. We use a lot of straw with potatoes. One of the strategies with reducing Colorado potato beetle is to use 5 or 6 inches of straw at planting. Potatoes grow up through that, and for some reason the Colorado potato beetle doesn't like colonizing those plots as much. So that can be one where it does a lot of good to have that. So just be careful. If you're using composted materials, make sure they're properly composted. They've gotten up to temperatures to eliminate plant diseases and things like that. I wouldn't use green mulch, like freshly chopped weeds and things like that can cause more problems. You can get some diseases and things that come off of them. So clean, good mulch should not be a problem.
Right. Anybody else have a question?
Rick, I have a question. I believe you said that some plants secrete things that attract other insects that may not necessarily be associated with a bloom.
Right.
What's some good examples of plants that have a secretion like that?
Okay. I don't know if you've ever looked at like a cherry leaf, on like a sweet cherry, the leaf, you see the leaf and then you have the little petiole, right, that the leaf attaches to the stem. There's a little thickened spot on that petiole of the cherry leaf, and that's actually a nectary. And I've seen like lady beetles, they'll stop at that nectar and they'll eat the nectar that's coming from that little swollen spot on the cherry leaf. Southern peas, for example, they also have these, what they call nectaries that are producing nectar, but they're on the stems of the leaves rather than on the in the flowers. And the interesting thing is you don't have to wait until the plant starts blooming. They'll actually start attracting some of these insects to these nectaries well before the plant's blooming, or possibly after the plant finishes its blooms. So those are the two examples I know. There may be others, but those are the two I know of.
Crowder peas, the southern pea, I guess it is, must secrete something around the tip of the pod, because I have to pick mine with gloves on because there's so many wasps hanging around there. I've actually got stung a couple of times just picking peas.
Yeah, actually, with the southern peas, I've probably seen a lot of paper wasps coming to those necks.
Yeah. Yeah. So is that something you consider beneficial? The wasp would be doing beneficial things in the garden as far as going after harmful insects?
It all depends upon the situation, because the paper wasps, I see them flying up and down plants, and they're hunting for caterpillars. And when they find a caterpillar, they sting it, they chop it up into pieces, and they bring it back to their nest and they feed it to their young. So that's very beneficial. They're hunting for caterpillars and they're killing caterpillars, and I'm happy with that. But when I grab that pod and I get stung, then it's a problem. So it all depends on the situation. You know, some things can be good some of the time and bad other parts of the time.
All right. Anybody else have any questions? Good questions.
Great job, Rick.
Yes, thank you, Rick. We really appreciate it. Thanks
Yeah,
so much.
good luck with this series.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
It's like a mini series. It goes on for hours and hours, days and days.
Have to put the recordings on Netflix.
That's it. All right. Got another question. The snails have been brutal to my cabbage and cucumbers in the garden. I was able to salvage the cukes I have growing in the flower pots, but not in the garden. So,
you know, we don't have a lot of the snails. You know, I understand the snails are the issue, but we don't have as many snail problems here in Lexington as slugs. And I don't know, something that they may want to experiment with is using some of the slug traps and just seeing, because slugs and snails are pretty closely related. What I would maybe try and do around some of those cabbage plants is take something like a tuna fish can, cut the lid off of it. You know, when you're done eating the tuna, bury that tuna fish can so the lip of the can is right at the soil level, and then putting some beer in that can. And what we found is that there was actually some people out in Colorado that tested this. They looked at different types of beer and which was the most attractive to the slugs. I always thought they were doing it so they could buy beer with grant funding, but they did that, and they found that the one that was most attractive to the stink bugs was actually the non-alcoholic beer.
I thought you were going to say Pabst Blue Ribbon.
But
so the near beer or something like that.
Yeah, near beer. It's not the alcohol they're attracted to. It's the yeast that makes the alcohol that attracts the snails. And so they did some of that. So I don't know. I would just see, can you attract the snails with some of those beer traps? And if you catch some, you know, put 8 or 10 of them out of those traps out there and see if you can try and control them that way. When we get dry,
does the beer work better than those metaldehyde baits?
The metaldehyde baits work pretty well. The problem is with the metaldehydes, every time it rains, you have to replace those baits. There's another one. It's a zinc phosphate, Sluggo, and that's another one of the snail and slug baits that also works.
Does that one have to be replaced with the rain, the Sluggo?
I don't think it's as sensitive as the metaldehyde.
Okay.
Another good question here. Wonder if live yeast would draw them in.
Yeah, I saw some people that had tried that. I didn't hear what the results were, but they were just using a little sugar water and yeast to bring them in.
Good questions.
So there's someone that said they had good success with the Sluggo and it lasts through the rains. So that's that iron phosphate.
Good to know.
The 11.4.
This is probably the year for snails and slugs with as much rain as we've had and as many rainy days.
Exactly.
As was last year and the year before.
Mhm.
We've got 3 years worth of buildup at this point.
And we had a mild winter to help them as well.
We've got one other issue, and that is that for Southwest Virginia, I think they have a periodical cicada outbreak possibly this year. Any thoughts on dealing with those?
Well, yeah, we've had a few periodical cicadas along the Ohio River from Louisville to down to Lyon County this year. They're probably just some that are coming out early, but you know, netting, we've done netting on some plants. The cicadas are going to be active for about 4 weeks or so, give or take a week. If you want to spray for them on some plants to keep the damage off, we found that the pyrethroid insecticides, things like permethrin, which would be the Bonide 8, work really well. But the first part of the emergence, they don't do much damage, but the second half, the second couple of weeks, that's when they start mating and do their egg laying. That's when the damage occurs. First 2 weeks, it's just the noise itself. Second 2 weeks, it's the noise and the egg laying.
Does
So
Mustang Max, do you know if, is Mustang Max one of those permethroid?
Yes, it is. Mustang Max would work very well. Next year is going to be another cicada year for us, for Kentucky, parts of Kentucky, like 2021, 2024, 2028. It's going to be quite a few emergences during this decade.
All right, we've got another question here. Cicada mentioned we have something eating the hot pepper in our greenhouse. They have attempted sprays and currently a small trap. Whatever it is small enough to eat the bait, but not throw the trap. Any ideas?
Can they let me know what part of the plant they're eating?
All of it.
All of it.
Okay, so yeah, I actually had problems with mice in my greenhouse this year, and they anywhere from the seedlings to you know, just emerging to first true leaves, they were eating the whole plants. The other thing would be cutworms, and I would look for cutworms. They can be in the media, but maybe pull a few plants that have been damaged out and go through whatever they're growing in to see if you can find some cutworms. If it is cutworms, even something like a BT spray or you know, a pyrethroid, you know, like the Mustang Max or Bonide 8 would work well. You can use all those in the greenhouse.
So they took out, destroyed all the hot pepper last year completely, especially the habanero. This year they're at it again and leave nothing above ground. We thought a mouse, but suspect something smaller.
I would bet a cutworm. The one thing we saw with the mouse this year is they left about a half-inch stem above ground. And I think that the cutworms would cut that a little bit closer. Again, I would use a pyrethroid insecticide, Bonite 8 or one of those others. Loves peanut butter. Well, that might be a mouse.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what works really good on those mice. If you've not tried those catch-alls, it's KETCH, and it'll catch up to 15 of them if you load it with bird seed. And we had really good luck. Those things will lay waste to chipmunks, shrews, and mice. Still no luck on catching voles, but definitely does a number on all the others.
Good information tonight. Anybody else have any? Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Rick, thanks so much. Thank you very much. Everybody, thank you all for tuning in tonight. Rick, thank you for tuning in. Give us some great information. Anybody want, I guess, Shad, Phil, you want to touch on a little bit of what's going on next week? I know we've got Tuesday and Thursday of next week. We've got some really good information as well. So looks like we've got flower and landscape plant care on Tuesday evening, and then catching honeybee swarms on Thursday evening. So Shad, Phil, y'all want to add to that or anything?
Neil Hunt's going to be speaking on the catching the swarms. And I know this is a little late. We've already had a lot of people catching swarms at this point, but they're still coming in. So
Yeah, the flower and landscape on Tuesday is going to be our intern Emily Woods, as well as one of our master gardeners, Beth Walker. They're going to tag team that, and so they're going to touch on a few things, including native plants and just some common landscape questions and flower questions folks may have.
Sounds good. Sounds like two good programs next week. Well, folks, if you don't have, if there's not any other questions or anything like that, Rick, we thank you. And good to see everybody on here again, and everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you all next Tuesday.
Thanks,
see you
Rick.
guys.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rick.
Good problem.